Hello and welcome to Channel 5 News. My name is John Moran and today we'll be discussing Idaho's minimum wage. If it were raised, what are the implications for workers, businesses, and employers alike? The education system, what can we do to improve it? And what about those 300 wild horses that were caught in central Idaho? Stay tuned and we'll be back right after break. Welcome back. Idaho's minimum wage is currently $7.25, and roughly 16,000 Idahoans are living on this wage. According to the Idaho Press, a full-time worker living on Idaho's minimum wage makes just enough to be considered above the poverty level. Alongside a stagnant wage, the cost of living and housing has increased in Idaho. Many agree that the wage of $7.25 is practically unlivable. But what would come with a raised minimum wage? How would raising the wage affect business owners and workers alike? Speaking now is Rosio Ojeda, a restaurant owner in Boise, Idaho. Hello, Rosio.
Thank you for having me. I am an owner of a restaurant in downtown Boise. I have a total of 50 employees working for me, and the average employee makes $10 an hour.
Are you in opposition or in support of raising the minimum wage, and why?
Well, if the minimum wage was raised, I would have to let some of my employees go due to the extra cost. I pay more than minimum wage already, so if the minimum wage is increased, I would have to pay my employees more. For my situation, I would oppose raising the minimum wage. However, for some businesses, raising the minimum wage would increase the productivity of employees, resulting in higher profit.
Can you expand on why some businesses would profit if the Idaho minimum wage was increased, and why some businesses would downsize or collapse?
In my opinion, small businesses like mine do not have much flexibility with their finances as bigger businesses do. In fact, when the minimum wage is raised, we will not be able to compete. We already are paying more than the minimum wage here in Idaho. Small businesses would lose employees or possibly go out of business.
It's been very enlightening, and thank you for joining us today to discuss your views on Idaho's minimum wage. Now we have one more speaker joining us today to discuss Idaho's minimum wage. Please welcome Kennedy Owens, an economist from Boise State University.
Hi John, thanks for having me. So it's important to understand the labor market in terms of supply and demand when you're questioning whether or not the minimum wage should be raised or lowered or kept the same. So essentially, what is a minimum wage? Well, it's a price floor that governments implement of which a price cannot fall below for a certain price of a market good. In this case, our good is the laborers, which is our supply, and being bought by the employers, which is the demand. So let's say we have a perfect equilibrium, which is here, where the demand and the supply meet. And essentially here, we aren't experiencing any surpluses or any deadweight losses. But when the government comes in and instills a price floor, in this case a minimum wage, we experience a deadweight loss for one, according to this theory, as well as unemployment in some cases, and losses of jobs. So when we're questioning whether or not a minimum wage should be higher or lowered, or even if there should be one at all, we run into two different schools of thought. Governments should not implement price floors because it creates market distortions, as we were talking about, such as deadweight loss and loss of social surplus. And then the second thought is that price floors, or minimum wage in this case, should be implemented to protect workers, because sometimes the minimum wage can be seen as practically unlivable. So some cons we run into when we talk about increasing the minimum wage is that there is an increase in unemployment. So when employers have to raise their prices, obviously employees are more willing to work and there's more of a supply, which when the employers have to raise their prices, that means that they have to pay, oh my god.
Okay,
so when we talk about the different cons of increasing the minimum wage, we run into increased unemployment. As when the price goes up, or in this case when the wage goes up, employers are obligated to pay more, which means that they are going to have to either downsize or lay off people in order to just respond to those costs. While the laborers, they're more incentivized to work, which means there's going to be more people entering the labor market, creating a surplus of laborers, so unemployment or a loss of jobs as well. And in some cases, a higher wage forces businesses to close because they just can't adjust to the higher costs. So now we're going to actually apply this theory to actual research, in which there was a 1994 study conducted in which two fast food industries, one being in New Jersey and one being Pennsylvania, were studied after a minimum wage increase, which took place in New Jersey but not in Pennsylvania. The study basically concluded that there was no indication that the rise in the minimum wage reduced employment. But on the other hand, the Congressional Budget Office projected that a minimum wage increase would actually result in a loss of 500,000 jobs. In a survey of about 1,000 businesses, 38% of employers who currently paid the minimum wage said that they would have to lay off some employees if the minimum wage was raised. Also, 54% said that they would decrease hiring levels, showing that there could potentially be a loss in jobs.
Thank you, Kennedy, for joining us today and talking about Idaho's minimum wage. As we discussed, minimum wage can be a complicated economic situation. On one hand, you have increased unemployment and a loss of jobs. On the other, you have reduced poverty and increased worker productivity. After the break, we'll talk about Idaho's education and what we can do to fix it. Stay tuned.